Today on the show, we are joined by Emeran Mayer. Emeran is a gastroenterologist, lecturer, author, neuroscientist, filmmaker, and a professor in the departments of medicine, physiology, and psychiatry at the School of Medicine at UCLA. Dr. Mayer is a pioneer of medical research into brain-gut interactions. Past books include The Mind-Gut Connection and most recently, The Gut-Immune Connection. Emeran, such a pleasure. Welcome to the show.
Nice to be in your show. Thanks for inviting me.
My pleasure. So when I was preparing for this, I kept thinking about a Hippocrates quote, which he said sometime probably about 2,500 years ago. And he said, all disease starts in the gut. This is a topic I know that you largely look at in your latest book, The Gut-Immune Connection. Does he have a point?
He definitely has a point, and I'm always amazed. I mean, he's from the Western medicine viewpoint, the traditional Western teachings of medicine. He stands out, but it's equally amazing to me, looking at Asian traditional teachings, how much on the point they were with their concepts, like um, and how do they get it without science, and some of these concepts have persisted for thousands of years. And yeah, coming back to Hippocrates, it must have been a lot of observation, and there were astute clinicians. We have lost that ability. I mean, even in my generation, when I see how I was trained, for example, to differentiate sounds from the heart, this whole art of auscultation, you could hear things that nobody else would ever hear listening to your heart. And the same thing listening to the sounds in your gut. Neurologists could make diagnoses without a CT scan. Most of these skills have disappeared. And so just in the last 15 years, because they're no longer being taught, we just get a CT scan or we get some blood tests, or so you can imagine somebody like Hippocrates, how much more trained their minds were to pick up things that we don't even see anymore, or hear, or smell, or so that's what I think. But it's clearly, this concept is clearly couldn't be more correct when and I'm saying this in my book. It's not just because I'm a gastroenterologist. I'm not biased because of that. But when you look at it, what central role the gut takes in our body's homeostasis, or overall functioning, it's obviously way beyond just a digestive organ. It is a homeostatic organ that connects and has long distance connections to everything else, and then it's the organ that we interact with our environment so intensely, with the food that we put in. that statement. So today, and this is sort of one of the messages in my book, that many of this epidemic of non-communicable chronic diseases that we're experiencing, that has sort of been forgotten with the pandemic. The pandemic is much more dramatic, and but this epidemic has been going on for 75 years, and you could trace it back really in many ways to the gut, and the things that we've done to the gut and the gut microbes, with our modern lifestyles, and the chemicals we put in, and the kind of food we put in. Yeah, so I'm a big fan of Hippocrates, not just because of that quote, but also because of his general, holistic view of health. And
Amazing. And you mentioned microbes, but one of the main things that I know that you talk about in your work is the gut microbiome. This is something which we've talked about previously on the show. I just figured, for the person listening to this now that just may not know, how would you best describe the microbiome?
yeah, so it depends what you talk about. If you talk about just the microbes, these 40 trillion microbes living inside of us, then the better term is really the microbiota, which is the plural of microbe. And if you talk about the microbiome, it's the microbes, these bugs plus their genes, plus their functional capabilities. So I think if you just want to speak about specific microbes, the microbiota is the better term. But most of the time, we're interested in the function of these microbes, or the microbiome, that term. And it's an interesting system. It's a system that we don't see. It's vast. The number of cells that are participating, of bacterial cells and um, um, fungi and archaea. It's. I mean, the bacteria are the biggest part. So it's invisible. It has by far the largest number of genes, in the millions, as opposed to our 20,000 human genes. It lives in close symbiosis, the system, with our gut. It produces molecules and has receptors that allows it to constantly communicate with our gut. And through that communication with the gut, it also can communicate with the rest of our body, because the gut is linked, networked into everything else in our body. So it's a remarkable system that we have ignored essentially in all our medical, teaching and research, until I would say, about 10 years ago, when that science really took off in an exponential fashion. And we're definitely not at the end yet. We do not know yet. Most of these millions of genes, we don't know what their function is. So kind of remarkable that we can actually practice medicine without knowing half of the system. What it does. I mean, it's that always puzzles me.
And did you mention that we have 40 trillion microbes in the gut?
Yeah, it's 40 trillion microbes. So, and there's, in the beginning, there have been comparisons. People were saying we have 10 times more microbes than human cells. That was abandoned, because if you add to the human cells our blood cells, so the white blood cells and the red blood cells, then it's about 40, 60, or I mean, you could say roughly about half. But it's still remarkable that you think that our, when we look at somebody, we don't look at we look at their muscles, we look at their face, we look at their eyes, we don't look at these microbes that make up half of their existence. And
so in theory, I mean, there's more microbes in our gut than there would be stars in the galaxy.
Yeah, that's another sort of amazing comparison. That hard. It's really hard to imagine. How that. And I mean, obviously, there's, just like in a galaxy, there's organizing principles. They're not just floating around in there, and and I mean, they're spatially organized. There's multiple ecosystems. So the microbes by themselves are an ecosystem, but then they have these subsystems. It starts in the mouth, then in the esophagus, in the stomach, in the small intestine, in the colon. Each of those subsystems has its own organizational principles, its different players, different chemicals that are being produced and exchanged, and also differences in how these different ecosystems interact with our body. That brings me also back to something, that in the traditional Chinese medicine, when they, when they talk about the meridians, and to talk about, they give them names based on organs, the large intestine and small intestine, the stomach. It's almost like, you could say in a non-scientific way, you could almost say, well, what's emerging may be that the microbial ecosystem in our large intestine is connected through meridian-like biological connections to the rest of our body, and does certain things. It's not. So what I'm trying to emphasize, it's not just 40 trillion, a blob of 40 trillion microorganisms. It's a very well organized, spatially and functionally organized system with subsystems that does specific things.
Yeah. And how quickly, this was something I was just thinking about, does those microbes, can they be changed from, say, someone eating a meal? Like, how quickly can those microbes be influenced?
They can be. So there's always two aspects to that question. One is the basics of the microbial organization is programmed early in life. There's always this term of the first 1,000 years, the first 1,000 days, or the first 3 years in life, where this fundamental programming occurs. And there's many factors, starting in utero, influences from the mother, and then the delivery and the breast milk, and so all these factors contribute to this shaping of that system. And so for a while, people thought, I mean, once you have it, it's stable and it doesn't change much. But then that would mean no matter what you do in terms of lifestyle changes, it doesn't make a difference. And so we now know that this microbial system is highly adaptable. Its boundaries are defined by this early programming, the general boundaries, but within these boundaries, it's very adaptive, and much more adaptive than our human cells. So I always bring this up, and probably one of the biggest advantages that we have by having this microbiome is humans have lived in different environments with different, have gone through in history and evolution through starvations, to extinctions, and at some point they were carnivores and lived of eating mammoths, and then some of them were vegetarians. So this ability to rapidly adapt to an environment would not be possible with our human makeup, because it takes genes about 15,000 years to adapt to a new environment. These microbes can do it within 48 hours. If you, so I don't know if you're a vegetarian or an omnivore or a carnivore, but if you were a vegetarian and you were given and willing to do this, few vegetarians would be willing to do it, given steak and hamburger for 48 hours, you would, and there have been studies on that, your microbes would adapt to this quickly, both in their composition, what players are coming up, and also in their functions. And the same is true if you were a carnivore, were put on a vegetarian diet, that would also change within 48 hours. That doesn't mean that every time you eat something, you go to a Thai restaurant and you have a different microbial makeup as if you eat in some other place. But this high adaptability is something that sort of comes back haunting us. So it's a theory that that's sort of been proposed by the Sonnenbergs from Stanford, that the microbes have adapted to this Western diet, which is obviously a big problem, for our health. The microbes have adapted to it fairly rapidly. Our immune system is not adapted to it. So now you have this mismatch of a rapidly adapted microbiome interacting with a ancient, like evolutionary ancient system, our immune system. And this mismatch creates this chronic stress reaction of the immune system and the body. So, so on the one side, the rapid adaptability of the microbiome is something extremely important for human survival. It's probably one of the reasons that contract of symbiosis, as was signed billions of years ago, between animals and microbes persisted, because it was such a benefit. On the other hand, it can also create, can create problems like this mismatch of the rapidly adapted microbes that have, that had to deal with the diet changes that we implemented 75 years ago, and our much slower immune system.
That's really interesting, and I want to come back there. One of the things that you said, which has really interested me was when you were talking about the first 1,000 days, and it's made me think. I'm really interested in developmental psychology and how those first few years of our life can really have such an enormous impact. And it's made me think: how does adverse childhood events experienced in those first 1,000 days alter our microbiome, and how does it alter the brain too?
Yeah, so I do want to emphasize when we talk first 1,000 days, that really starts in utero, because so the pregnant mother has a microbiome, and so depending on what the mother does, lifestyle wise and diet wise, these microbes produce signaling molecules that go through the mother's body, including crossing the placenta and going to the developing fetus.
Well,
So the mother's lifestyle, and I would say with diet and chronic stress level being the two main factors, that will influence. So the fetus doesn't have its own microbiome, but it receives all these signals from the mother's microbiome. So it's not just starting at birth. The adversity starts before delivery, and then it kind of continues. There's been amazing studies that like chronically stressed animals have pregnant animals have a different microbial composition of their vaginal microbes, and during delivery, it's really a mixture of fecal and vaginal microbes that the baby is exposed to. But if the mother was stressed, she has a different microbial composition in her birth canal, which will then colonize the newborn's GI tract. So it's not just the diet of the mother that influences that that infant's development and brain development, but it's also this handing over of the first microbial ecosystem from the mother to the infant that's influenced by the mother's lifestyle and stress level, and probably also diet as well. So there's this intense interconnectedness, of starting in utero. And then now what happens when we talk about adverse early life events in a more traditional way, psychological way, it became obvious, both from human observations, as many studies, that it can influence not just brain development, but has a major influence on health, many aspects of health and chronic disease. And early adverse life events would include not just, as initially thought, like sexual abuse. Excuse me. Much more common are other things like emotional neglect, or disharmony between the parents, instability of the family environment, chronic illness of the primary caregiver, chronic stress of the primary caregiver. So there's many of these factors that have been studied. There's questionnaires to do this, and then it's been shown in animal models that this model called maternal separation. You take the litter away from the mother, and then the offspring, that litter that has been separated for 180 minutes a day for 2 weeks from the mother, develops an altered stress responsiveness, changes in the brain, molecular changes. And it's interesting because initially it was thought it's that separation, that trauma of separation. But new research has already shown that the mother is so stressed when the pups are taken away for 3 hours each day, that the maternal behavior changes towards the pups. So the mother that normally licks the pups and grooms them and has a particular position, is arch back position, sort of spreading out over the pups, that's disturbed. So it's the stress of the mother changing the maternal behavior that then affects these developments in the pups. And then the latest thing of that story first, like when we and many others, did sort of pioneering work in this field. I mean, we also found that there's an alteration in gut function, and these pups had greater frequency of fecal pellet expulsion and were more sensitive to gut distension. And but then, more recently, research has shown, friend and colleague John Cryan in Cork, Ireland, that it also affects the microbial composition and function. And that's not surprising because the microbes, their environment is the gut. So if the gut changes in its peristalsis, its contractions, and its fluid secretion, that changes the environment of the microbes. So the microbes, as we said earlier, adapt to that. And so when you think about it, the chronic stress of the mother that has her pups removed for 2 or 3 hours a day, translating into a changed stress system of the pups, the growing of pups, that affects the gut function and that affects the microbes. So it's like this chain of events that happens. And we've published a recent study that in adults, with and without a history of early adversity, that we found that that gut microbial metabolites were different in the group that indicated, I mean, this is retrospective on questionnaires, that they had a positive early adverse life history. Mm-hmm. So it may well be that persists throughout life, and that this altered gut microbiome then plays a role why people with early adversity have a higher frequency of chronic diseases of all kinds, So
right. And this is really interesting to me because I had a conversation with Dr. Frank Lippmann on the podcast, and I remember that he said that to him health was a kind of yin and yang equation, and the yin was the 8 hours of sleep, it was the fruits and the vegetables, it was the legumes, it was the optimizing your health through an aura ring or whatever your vehicle of choice is, and then the yang was the love and the joy and the gratitude and the connectedness. And I would say, quite skeptical about that. I mean, to me, I kind of looked at health really through a biological and a physical state as opposed to, I guess, a psychological one. But recently I read a great book, and it was called Dying to Be Me. And for the first time, it was really one of those books that it really got me thinking about the impact that thoughts and emotions and feelings can actually have on our health. And listening to you, but that really got me thinking. And do you believe that, say, chronic, I guess, toxic emotions would be the word I would use, hate, anger, resentment, could significantly affect those microbes in our gut?
Yeah, I'm almost convinced of that, because we know, I mean, there are pathways, there's at least 2 major pathways that transmits whatever goes on in the brain to our microbes. So one is the direct pathway. The sympathetic nervous system has been best studied with this, with its neurotransmitter, norepinephrine. So the first studies were, people added norepinephrine to a petri dish with isolated cells and isolated microbes, and these microbes not only change behavior but also change their gene expression. And initially, this was thought to only happen with pathogens, like with E. coli. But then, I think up to 15 different types of microbes have been studied, both the pathogens, which make these pathogens more aggressive. This was a science that was kind of inspired in quotation marks by people studying pigs that were taken to slaughter that develop all kinds of diseases and get sick and die. And then it was found that, their excessive stimulation of their sympathetic nervous system affects their gut, big surprise, but also their gut microbes, and the greater propensity of these animals for infections was pretty related to that these microbes became more aggressive under that stress. And but in the meantime, we also know it's not just pathogens that are being altered. It's also the good guys that live in our gut. So stress, particularly chronic stress, we almost know for sure, and there's many studies now in monkeys and humans, they change both the relative abundances, the diversity, and the function of many good microbes, like lactobacilli in our gut. So that's one thing. It's a direct effect, and it's mediated by receptors for our own stress neurotransmitters, norepinephrine, on the microbes, which is an amazing thing when you think about it. But the other one is that we mentioned earlier, stress is so closely connected to gut function, every aspect of gut function, blood flow, secretion of fluid, secretion of acid, contractions, what we call motility, transit times, that chronic stress essentially changes the environment. All of a sudden the microbes live in a different environment. They're affected directly, but they're also affected in that environment that they live in. And so this has been, studied mainly for stress. And I would say chronic stress is always the more relevant things for human psychopathology. And certainly we are exposed to, a lot more chronic stress today than our ancestors, who had more severe acute stresses, but not that cumulative allostatic load, as we call it. And yeah, I would say, even though the studies are not as clear, like anger, all the negative emotions, anger, fear, envy, that all these negative emotions essentially create a mirror image at the gut level and even the gut microbial level. Some of these may not be, so it may take a while before science really disentangles this. Clearly we're still in the midst of a rapid evolution of technologies of studying details of gut microbial function. But based on what we know today about brain-gut interactions and how microbes are affected by these interactions, I would bet all my money on it that both positive and negative emotions create these images at the gut level, at the microbial level, and at the genetic level, really, at the gene expression level. It's not just having more or less of these bugs there. It's really changes gene expression and transcription,
I find this so fascinating. One thing that I got from your book, The Mind-Gut Connection, was how much serotonin there is in the gut. Isn't it like 95% or something like that of the serotonin is in the gut? I find that absolutely fascinating. And then that makes me think, how much is our mental health impacted by, I guess, the foods and the diet that we consume?
Yeah, no, this is definitely something, this whole field of nutritional psychiatry, it's in its infancy, but there's already evidence for that this, that food plays a significant role. There's so many other factors. So the problem is there's so many other factors that have changed, let's say, in the last 75 years in our lifestyles, our chronic stress level, just the increase in stress level during the last 2 years of the pandemic are tremendous. So how much, what the relative roles are of the diet part and of the stress part is hard to disentangle, but they interfere with each other as well, because a lot of people under stress eat an unhealthier diet, more fast food, more comfort foods to so temporarily suppress the anxiety and the stress perception. But this nutritional psychiatry, it's in its infancy. We know from some areas, like the serotonin story and the precursor serotonin being tryptophan, the essential amino acid, that 50 years ago we thought the main function of tryptophan is we need that for building proteins in our bodies, the traditional the nutrition theory. In the meantime, we know that that our microbes break down, together with the help of other enzymes in our gut, metabolize tryptophan into different neurotransmitters, some good, some bad. Serotonin clearly one of the good ones, but then there's also a substance called kynurenine, which has been implicated in many negative health effects on the brain, and also the indoles. That's another group, and it's kind of interesting that. Sorry, I hope you're going to be able to cut out some of this.
Of course. We've got a guy, he does a good job.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting that, again, that the brain plays a big role in determining what pathway the microbes will take this tryptophan, if they take it towards serotonin. But when you're stressed, when you're chronically stressed, it takes it more towards this indole pathway and the kynurenine pathway, which has negative effects on the nervous system. So this is definitely a yin and yang where this applies to, that you have, you take tryptophan as a precursor, and then you can generate the beneficial parts and the negative parts, and the balance of these two ultimately determines your health status. But this tryptophan is only one of several amino acids, that is broken down into these transmitters that we're now beginning to understand, like indoxyl sulfate is one of these indoles that has shown up in increased amounts in kids with autism spectrum disorder and in Alzheimer's disease, and which is another interesting thing, that some of these metabolites are showing up not just in one disease. It's almost, it seems to me, pure speculation. My holistic brain sort of projects this in the future, that all our mental diseases are just mosaics of different subtle disturbances of these balances between these transmitters.
Wow.
And with the microbes playing a big role in determining what relationships and relative abundances there are. That when you say somebody has, and we know this because there's obviously comorbidity between anxiety and depression, but also between anxiety and Alzheimer's disease, and really between many of these neurological and psychiatric disorders. And I think the best explanation is that you have substances like this indoxyl sulfate that the microbes generate exclusively. So only they have the enzyme that can break down tryptophan into these indoles, not our bodies, only the microbes. That they would have such an important role in determining these balances between these different metabolites that ultimately affect our brain health. It's pretty remarkable.
That really makes me think then that if these microbes play such an essential part, even potentially in, as you say, psychiatric illness, potentially, then how much control does the person listening to this have now over the health of, let's say, their microbiota, their microbes, or how much of that is controlled by, I guess, genetics, or, as you say, early life experiences?
Yeah, so it's definitely not one factor. I think when we think about what ability do we have to counteract these multiple factors that determine who we are and what state of health we're in. So we talked about the early life events, we talked about the prenatal events. Genetics definitely a big event in some diseases more than in others. So if you don't have the vulnerability genes for autism spectrum disorders, which I think it's about 10% of the population has these vulnerability genes, which is interesting in itself because it means there must be some adaptive value to have those traits, these autistic or Asperger-like traits. And I wouldn't be surprised in this new world of everything being on social media, on the internet, that some of these traits are actually advantageous, but if you have these autism spectrum vulnerability genes, then other factors like diet and what happens, your mother's diet, or if your mother was obese when she was pregnant, interact with these vulnerability genes and make it much more likely that you develop, or this child develops, and that's pretty true about all our diseases, to varying degrees. In some, the genetics play a bigger role. In others, these epigenetic factors or early life events play a bigger role. It's again, fast forwarding 50 years from now, I predict we'll have supercomputers that can actually calculate that risk. You put in all this stuff in the genetics and the epigenetics and the diet part, and then you get a risk score, of and we may not be 50 years away from this. There's already attempts, to get to that closer, by companies and scientists, but I think that's certainly going to happen, and it will require taking all these factors into consideration. Um, and there's unique human factors as well. Resilience is another one. So we know relatively little about resilience. You may have all these bad things that happen to you early in life, and there are studies on this. We've done a survey on it. You may have had the early adversity, and you may have the genetics, but then if you score very high on the resilience scale, then you may not be affected by all this. So there's some innate ability of the brain to counteract all the negative influences. That's another fascinating area about health in general. We've focused so much on the disease and the factors that cause disease that we've kind of neglected the resilience part and what biology underlies resilience, and how can we teach or strengthen the resilience. That I think that's a really big part of health.
For sure. I always considered weight loss to be a simple equation. To me, it was always a simple formula: calories in versus calories out. Right? And I personally used a fitness tracker, say MyFitnessPal. I would aim for, say, a 500 calorie deficit per day. Over the course of a week, I would be in a 3,500 calorie deficit, which was a pound of body fat. And, I knew that consistently that could work for me. Will Bolshevitz, when he came on the show, he said that I don't think that it's actually that simple. I think that the microbiome has a lot to say about that. How does the microbes in our gut impact weight loss or weight gain?
So we certainly know from studies that people with obesity, have different microbial compositions and different metabolites, which then play a role in development of diabetes. So certainly, our microbes, so our ancestors in evolution, a big part of their nutrition, of their calories, came from what the microbes did with all the plant food that they ate. So the average intake's been estimated 80 grams of fiber per day for some of our ancestors, even some some people living in Africa that still live on sort of pre-industrial diets.
And what do we eat now in the modern world? What's the average now?
Well, it's recommended. I think it's recommended 20 or 30, but in reality, it's probably less than 10. If the hyper, um, the ultra processed diet is taking all the fibers out. I mean, we've developed a taste preference for fiber-free food, essentially. It's and that's marketed very aggressively. So, but going back, in evolution, so the microbes serve this capacity of extracting or sort of harvesting probably about 30% of our caloric needs from breaking down this plant-based food, these complex carbohydrates, fiber, into absorbable molecules like short-chain fatty acids, and so this played a big role, and then it has changed dramatically. Now the microbes get very little of that's kind of a food. So we absorb most of our calories in the small intestine. We don't rely on the microbes anymore. And over evolution, our colon has gotten smaller because we don't need this big, habitat for our microbes to do the work. And so you could say, the microbes still play a big role in harvesting calories, and how that differs between people that are obese and so get the same amount of calories, but depending on if it's more fiber rich or less in fiber, we would ultimately, get less calories. I mean, one thing that plays a role there, the microbial breakdown of plant-based fiber into absorbable short-chain fatty acids is less efficient than the absorption of small intestine, which is rapid. Glucose, sugar, and fats rapidly absorbed in our small intestine, much faster, much more efficient than in the colon. So if you could say somebody eats the same amount of calories, but one is 2/3 in the form of fiber and plant-based foods, and the other 2/3 in the form of highly processed food, maybe the same over amount of calories, but that person that relies on the microbes will gain much less weight than somebody who absorbs it all rapidly within the small intestine. I mean, just take like the desserts. So somebody, it's kind of interesting, like in some parts of the US, like in Southern California, many restaurants have stopped serving desserts because people are so calorie conscious. And if you calculate, I put these numbers in my book, I've forgotten the exact numbers, but the typical dessert that you would get in some of the most popular restaurants, is more than 1,000 calories, and it's all in form of fat and sugar that you absorb rapidly. So nothing goes to the microbes. As opposed to eating a piece of fruit at the end of your meal, half of which is fiber and is less efficiently converted into short-chain fatty acids. So, that's sort of a good example of that. So it's not just the amount of calories that you count, but it's also, were these calories processed? Are they processed in the less efficient way, in the ancient way, in our large intestine, or are they absorbed rapidly in the small intestine? So I think the microbes do play a big role, and many people. So you have this example that you practice, which is effective for a lot of people. And not everybody can do it, to go into these daily calorie deficits, but another way of doing it is you may want to eat the same amount, but you change to a largely plant-based diet, and will lose weight on that as well. So
we've gone through so much today. We've covered so much ground. I want to finish off. We've talked about kind of the importance of of the get. We've gone through so much today. I'd love to just finish off and ask you for your best tips. I guess could be dietary, could be lifestyle, could be anything you like for to keep our microbes in our gut healthy. What would be some of your best tips?
So, well, let's start with the most general thing. So it's clearly it's lifestyle, it's diet, it's sleep, it's exercise, and it's the mind. A calm, non-reactive mind. So they all interact, and we don't have time to talk about this, but they all converge on the gut. I mean, all these factors, influence the immune system in the gut. And if you talk about diet, simple advice is focus on what you eat. So that's one thing. And, I think a lot of evidence supports this concept of the largely plant-based diet. I somewhat disagree or slightly disagree with my friend Will. So he's a vegan. I'm not a vegan. We eat fish and poultry, which I don't think have any negative effects on your health, depending on. So here's point number 2. It's not just what you eat. Make sure you know where your food comes from. Is it all farm raised? So farm raised salmon doesn't have the omega-3 fatty acids anymore, or is depleted. Food that's grown with chemical fertilizers in a modern agricultural way is deficient in polyphenols, very important health, promoting type of molecule. So where the food is coming from may be equally important is what you're eating. So the other thing, the third thing is, this is where it comes in, this this One Health concept that I promote. Think about what impact that food that you eat has on the environment and on the planet. That's third. And the fourth one is, when do you eat it? Do you stick to a time restricted eating schedule, which has gotten a lot of attention? People refer to this as intermittent fasting. I like the time restricted eating name better, because it's really compressing the amount of time that you put food in your stomach to 8 hours and leave the gut for 16 hours on its own. That is important because the gut does a lot of things when it's not full with food and occupied with processing food. It generates a cleansing mechanism of contractions. It changes the distance between the microbes and your gut and the interactions. So there's a lot of positive things that happen during the 16 hours of food restriction. And you can still eat, you can eat the cake and have it too. You can still eat your same amount of calories, but it's restricted to a certain window during the day. Everybody can do that. It's not that hard to do. It's not as hard to do as true fasting, where you don't eat for a day or longer. So four factors in terms of diet: what do you eat, when you eat it, where does it come from, and what impact it has on the planet. It's a lot to think about when you go to the market, but I think gradually, we have to teach people to develop that consciousness. In terms of sleep, sleep is really important, kind of goes along with this time restricted eating, because when you sleep, obviously your gut is empty, unless you have a bad habit of waking up at 2 a.m. and then eating a bowl of ice cream and going back to sleep. It should be empty during your sleep. So a good night's sleep has a beneficial effect on the gut and its microbes. There's many studies on that as well. It has kind of an anti-inflammatory effect on on the immune system within the gut. So that's exercise. Moderate exercise is definitely beneficial. There's many examples now, even before the microbiome, that a moderate amount of regular aerobic exercise will add to, combined with diet and a few other factors, 10 disease-free years to your life when you start at age 50. Whereas, extreme exercise is a stress for the body and the gut, just like any psychological stress. There's exceptions, I think, to this rule of high performance athletes, which obviously don't do this for their entire life. But even those athletes, I have a lot of patients that come with gut problems, like marathon runners, ultra marathon runners. It's not healthy for the gut, that we know for sure, and nor for your microbes. It almost does the same bad things as chronic stress does on your gut. So regular, moderate aerobic exercise is another one of those. And then the last but not least, a mindfulness attitude, that you always, remind yourself what happens in your brain doesn't stay in the brain. It goes to your gut. It goes to the rest of your body. It goes to your microbes, as we talked about earlier. And practicing this mindful lifestyle, it's become very popular in the US. I don't know about the UK. There's apps to do this, so everybody can do this. So the good thing is, all the things that I told you are not rocket science, do not require huge efforts. There's apps for all of these now, for the diet part, for the for the exercise part. So I think the web-based devices have made it easier to follow these, as long as you have a master plan, what you need to do, and not get distracted by all this chatter on the internet about, here's the latest fat diet, and you can't eat this, and you can't eat this, and then you get labels on your food that have 15 categories of items that does not contain 15 things. That's not the way to go. The way to go is to really have an active program, feel that you are responsible, you're in charge, and you can influence your health. If you start with this early, if you start with this in age 80 and have cognitive decline, not sure you will do a lot. But if you start at 40 or even at 30 with some of these techniques, I think your long-term health and longevity is in your hands, really.
I love it, man. That was fantastic advice. I got one last question for you that we sign off all our podcasts with, and then please signpost these guys to wherever you want to send them to. My last question for you that we always ask is, what makes a life worth living?
Yeah, very good. I mean, you should have asked me this before to think about it. I personally think, and I've worked on this a lot in my own life, and now even more than earlier, where you sort of lived your life, sort of it unfolded more. Now you're much more conscious. I would say there's a few points. It's a life filled with passion, that and excitement, that whatever you do, it comes out of passion and excitement. I think that's a key thing. I've observed this in many people in their 90s that kept that attitude. I think compassion is a very important part of it. It's not just you are just one part of a huge network on the planet, and anything you do for that network ultimately is good for you as well, for your health. Many studies, scientific studies, that have shown this, that happiness, that you get more benefit health-wise from an attitude of compassion and doing meaningful things for you and for others than just your personal happiness. So I would say those would be the main things. The more I look at this from my own profession, I think the biggest satisfaction I get when I think back how many patients I've helped and made their life better, and how many students I've helped in their careers. I mean, that makes me feel really good, and that I've only done things in my life that were guided by my passion, and not by money, not by conventions, by advice from my parents, but from my own passion. I think that I would say that's the important one.
I love it, man. Where can these guys connect with you?
Probably an easy way to connect with me is on my website, emeranmayer.com. Just say Emeran Mayer with Mayer.com. And they, can sign up for a newsletter, which will give them up-to-date information. All my I'm on all the social media. That's all this information is on the website. Yeah, I would say that's the easiest way to connect with me. And I hope a lot of your listeners will take advantage of that.
Absolutely. I'll link our audience to the books of yours, which we've discussed today. Man, this was a real pleasure for me. This was an information dense hour. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me on the show. It was a pleasure. What I said in the beginning, it's wonderful to meet some of these extremely educated, wise podcast hosts, because the kind of questions you ask are just really, gets me excited to answer them.